Chapter 19. Before we begin, let me remind you that Ralph Nickleby is really the villain of the whole story. He's a moneylender, and Dickens uses the old-fashioned word, the biblical word, usurer. It means not just a moneylender, but a dishonest moneylender, someone who squeezes as much money out of those people who are in debt to him as possible and brings them, if possible, to ruin. That's the kind of person Ralph Nickleby is. And in his sights, he's got a young aristocrat called Lord Verisopht. And he intends to get as much as he can of Lord Verisoft's money by squeezing him into debt and ruining him. We shall hear more about that in chapter 19. The bile and rancour of the worthy Miss Nagg undergoing no diminution during the remainder of the week, but rather augmenting with every successive hour, and the honest ire of all the other young ladies rising, or seeming to rise, in exact proportion to the good spinster's indignation, and both waxing very hot every time Miss Nickleby was coursed upstairs, it will be readily imagined that the young lady's daily life was none of the most cheerful or enviable kind. She hailed the arrival of Saturday night as a prisoner would a few delicious hours' respite from slow and wearisome torture, and felt that the poor pittance for her first week's labour would have been dearly and hardly earned had its amount been trebled. When she joined her mother, as usual, at the street corner, she was not a little surprised to find that her uncle was standing next to her mother, and they were in conversation. But her surprise was redoubled, no less by the matter of their conversation than by the smoothed and altered manner of Ralph Nickleby himself. "Ah, my dear," said Ralph, "we were at that moment talking about you." "Indeed," replied Kate, shrinking, though she scarce knew why, from her uncle's cold, glistening eye. "That instant," said Ralph, "I was coming to call for you, to make sure to catch you before you left. But your mother and I have been talking over family affairs, and the time has slipped away so rapidly." "Well, now, hasn't it?" interposed Mrs. Nickleby, quite insensible to the sarcastic tone of Ralph's last remark. "Upon my word, I couldn't have believed it possible that such... Kate, my dear, you are to dine with your uncle at 6:30 tomorrow." Triumphing in having been the first to communicate this extraordinary intelligence, Mrs. Nickleby nodded and smiled a great many times to impress its full significance on Kate's wondering mind, and then flew off in an acute angle to a committee of ways and means. "Let me see," said the good lady. "Your black silk frock will be quite dress enough, my dear, with that pretty little scarf and a plain band in your hair. Oh, dear me," cried Mrs. Nickleby, flying off at another angle. "If I had but those unfortunate amethysts of mine. You recollect them, Kate, my dear? How they used to sparkle, you know. But your papa, your poor dear papa, there was never anything so cruelly sacrificed as were those jewels. Never." Overpowered by this agonizing thought, Mrs. Nickleby shook her head in a melancholy manner and applied her handkerchief to her eyes. "I don't want them, mamma, indeed I don't," said Kate. "Forget you ever had them." "Lord, Kate, my dear," rejoined Mrs. Nickleby, pettishly, "how can you talk such things? 24 silver teaspoons, brother-in-law, 2 gravies, 4 salts, all the amethysts, necklace, brooch, and earrings, all made away with at the same time, and I saying almost on my bended knee to that poor good soul, 'Why don't you do something, Nicholas? Why don't you make some arrangement?' I am sure that anybody who was about us at the time will tell you the justice to own that I said that once, if I said it 50 times a day. Didn't I, Kate, my dear? Did I ever lose an opportunity of impressing that upon your dear papa?" No, mamma, never," said Kate. "Ah," said Mrs. Nickleby with great fervour, "if my advice had been taken at the beginning, well, I have always done my duty, and that is some comfort." When she arrived at this reflection, Mrs. Nickleby sighed, rubbed her hands, cast up her eyes, and finally assumed a look of meek composure, thus importing that she was a persecuted saint, but that she wouldn't trouble her hearers by mentioning the circumstance which must be so obvious to everyone anyway. "Now," said Ralph with a smile, which, in common with all other tokens of emotion, seemed to skulk under his face rather than play boldly over it, "to return to the point from which we have strayed, I have a little party of gentlemen with whom I am connected in business just now at my house tomorrow, and your mother, Kate, has promised that you shall come and keep house for me. In other words, decorate the occasion with female company. I am not much used to parties, but this is one of business, and such fooleries are an important part of it sometimes. You don't mind obliging me, do you?" "Mind!" cried Mrs. Nickleby. "My dear Kate, why—" "Pray," interrupted Ralph, motioning her to be silent, "I spoke to my niece." "I shall be very glad, of course, uncle," replied Kate, "but I am afraid you will find me awkward and embarrassed." "Oh, no," said Ralph. "Come when you like. In a hackney coach. I'll pay for it. Good night. God bless you." The blessing seemed to stick in Mr. Ralph Nickleby's throat as if it were not used to the thoroughfare and didn't know the way out. But it got out somehow, though awkwardly enough, and having disposed of it, he shook hands with his relatives and abruptly left them. "What a very remarkable and wonderful countenance your uncle has," said Mrs. Nickleby, quite struck with his parting look. "I don't see the slightest resemblance to his poor brother." In good time or in bad time, as the reader takes it. For Mrs. Nickleby's impatience went a great deal faster than the clocks at that end of the town, and Kate was dressed to the very last hairpin a full hour and a half before it was at all necessary to begin to think about it. In good time or in bad time, the toilet was completed, and it being at length the hour agreed upon for starting, the milkman fetched a coach from the nearest stand, and Kate, with many adieux to her mother, and many kind messages to Miss La Creevy, who was come to tea, seated herself in it, and went away in state, if ever anybody went away in state in a hackney coach. And the coach and the coachman and the horses rattled and jangled and whipped and cursed and swore and tumbled on together until they came to Golden Square. The coachman gave a tremendous double knock at the door, which was opened long before he had done, as quickly as if there'd been a man behind it with his hand tied to the latch. Kate, who had expected no more than an uncommon appearance than Newman Noggs in a clean shirt, was not a little astonished to see that the opener was a man in handsome livery, and that there were 2 or 3 others in the hall. This was no doubt the right house, for there was a name upon the door. So she accepted the laced coat sleeve which was tended her, and entering the house was ushered upstairs into a back drawing room, where she was left alone. Presently she heard a series of loud double knocks at the street door, and after every knock some new voice in the next room. The tones of Mr. Ralph Nickleby were easily distinguishable at first, but by degrees they merged into the general buzz of conversation, and all she could ascertain was that there were several gentlemen with no very musical voices who talked very loud, laughed very heartily, and swore more than she would have thought quite necessary. But this was a question of taste. At length the door opened, and Ralph himself, divested of his boots and ceremoniously embellished with black silks and shoes, presented his crafty face. I couldn't see you before, my dear, he said in a low tone, and pointing as he spoke to the next room. I was engaged in receiving them. Now, shall I take you in? Pray, uncle, said Kate, a little flurried, as people much more conversant with society often are when they are about to enter a room full of strangers and have had time to think of it previously. Are there any ladies here? No, said Ralph shortly. I don't know any. Must I go in immediately? Asked Kate, drawing back a little. As you please, said Ralph, shrugging his shoulders. They're all come, and dinner will be announced directly afterwards, that's all. Kate would have entreated a few minutes' respite, but reflecting that her uncle might consider the payment of the hackney coach fare a sort of bargain for her punctuality, she suffered him to draw her arm through his and lead her away. 7 or 8 gentlemen were standing round the fire when they went in, and as they were talking very loudly, were not aware of their entrance until Mr. Ralph Nickleby, touching one on the coat sleeve, said in a harsh, emphatic voice, as if to attract general attention, Lord Frederick Verysoft, this is my niece, Miss Nickleby. The group dispersed as if in great surprise, and the gentleman addressed, turning round, exhibited a suit of clothes of the most superlative cut, a pair of whiskers of similar quality, a moustache, a head of hair, and a young face. Eh? Said the gentleman. What the devil? With which broken ejaculation he fixed his glass in his eye and stared at Miss Nickleby in great surprise. My niece, my lord, said Ralph. Then my ears did not deceive me, and it's not a waxwork, ha ha, said his lordship. How do you do? I'm very happy. And then his lordship turned to another more superlative gentleman something older, something stouter, something redder in the face, and something longer upon town, and said in a loud whisper that the girl was devilish pretty. "Introduce me, Nickleby," said this second gentleman, who was lounging with his back to the fire and both elbows on the chimney-piece. "Sir Mulberry Hawk," said Ralph. "Otherwise known as the most knowing card in the pack, Miss Nickleby," said Lord Frederick, very soft. "Don't leave me out, Nickleby," cried a sharp-faced gentleman who was sitting in a low chair with a high back, reading a newspaper. "Mr. Pye," said Ralph. "Nor me, Nickleby," cried a gentleman with a flushed face and a flash air from the elbow of Sir Mulberry Hawk. "Mr. Pluck," said Ralph. Then, wheeling about again towards a gentleman with the neck of a stork and the legs of no animal in particular, Ralph introduced him as the Honourable Mr. Snob, and a white-haired person at a table was introduced as Colonel Chaucer. The colonel was in conversation with somebody who appeared to be a make-weight and didn't need to be introduced at all. Soon dinner was announced, and Sir Mulberry Hawk, in an excess of humour, shot dexterously past the other gentleman and, seizing Kate's arm through his, escorted her downstairs. The dinner was remarkable for the splendour and completeness of its appointments, and the company were remarkable for doing it ample justice, in which respect Messrs. Pye and Pluck particularly singled themselves out, these two gentlemen eating of every dish and drinking of every bottle with a capacity and perseverance truly astonishing. They were remarkably fresh, too, notwithstanding their great assertions, for on the appearance of the dessert they broke out again as if nothing serious had taken place since breakfast. "Well," said Lord Frederick, sipping his first glass of port, "if this is a discounting dinner, all I have to say, devil take me, if it wouldn't be a good plan to have a discount dinner every day." "You'll get plenty of it in your time," returned Sir Mulberry Hawk. "Nickleby will tell you that." "What do you say, Nickleby?" inquired the young man. "Am I going to be a good customer to you?" "It depends entirely on circumstances, my lord," replied Ralph. "On your lordship's circumstances," interposed Colonel Chaucer of the militia and the racecourse. All this while Kate had sat as silently as she could, scarcely daring to raise her eyes, lest they should encounter the admiring gaze of Lord Frederick Verisopht, or, what was still more embarrassing, the bold looks of his friend Sir Mulberry. The latter gentleman was obliging enough to direct general attention towards her by saying, "Here's Miss Nickleby, wondering why the deuce somebody doesn't make love to her." No, indeed," said Kate, looking hastily up. And then she stopped, feeling it would have been better to have said nothing at all. "I'll hold any man £50, said Sir Mulberry, "that Miss Nickleby can't look in my face and tell me she wasn't thinking that somebody might come and make love to her." "Done!" cried the noble lord. "Within 10 minutes." "Done!" responded Sir Mulberry. The money was produced on both sides, and the Honourable Mr. Snob was elected to the double office of stakeholder and timekeeper. "Pray," said Kate in great confusion, while these preliminaries were in course of completion, please, don't make me the subject of any bets. Uncle, I cannot really—" "Why not, my dear?" replied Ralph, in whose grating voice, however, there was an unusual huskiness, as though he spoke unwillingly and would rather that the that the proposition had not been broached. "It'll be done in a moment. There's nothing in it. If the gentlemen insist upon it—" "I don't insist on it," said Sir Mulberry with a loud laugh. "Oh, no! That is, I by no means insist upon Miss Nickleby's making the denial, for if she does, I lose. But I shall be glad to see her bright eyes, especially as she favours the mahogany so much." "So she does, and it's too bad of you, Miss Nickleby," said the noble youth. "Quite cruel," said Mr. Pye. "Horrid cruel," said Mr. Puck. "I don't care if I do lose," said Sir Mulberry, "for one tolerable look at Miss Nickleby's eyes is worth double the money." "More," said Mr. Pye. "Far more," said Mr. Pluck. "How does the enemy time go, Snob?" asked Sir Mulberry Hawk. 4 minutes gone." "Bravo!" "Won't you make an effort for me, Miss Nickleby?" asked Lord Frederick after a short interval. "You needn't trouble yourself to inquire, me buck," said Sir Mulberry. "Miss Nickleby and I understand each other. She declares on my side and shows her taste. You haven't a chance, old fellow. What's the time, Snob?" 8 minutes gone." "Get the money ready," said Sir Mulberry. "You'll soon have to hand it over." "Ha, ha, ha, ha!" laughed Mr. Pye. Mr. Pluck, who always came second and topped his companion if he could, screamed outright. The poor girl was so overwhelmed with confusion that she scarcely knew what she did, and had determined to remain perfectly quiet, but fearing that by so doing she might seem to countenance Sir Mulberry's boast, which had been uttered with great coarseness and vulgarity of manner, raised her eyes and looked him straight in the face. There was something so odious, so insolent, so repulsive in the look which met her, that without the power to stammer forth a syllable, she rose and hurried from the room. She restrained her tears by a great effort until she was alone upstairs, and then gave them vent. "Capital!" said Sir Mulberry, putting the stakes in his pocket. "That's a gal of spirit, and we'll drink her health." Meanwhile, Kate, left wholly to herself, had, in some degree, recovered her composure. She had learnt from a female attendant that her uncle wished to see her before they left, and had also gleaned the satisfactory intelligence that the gentlemen would take coffee at table. The prospect of seeing them no more contributed greatly to calm her agitation, and taking up a book, she composed herself to read. She started sometimes when the sudden opening of the dining-room door let loose a wild shout of noisy revelry, and more than once rose in great alarm as a fancied footstep upon the staircase impressed her with the fear that some stray member of the party was returning alone. Nothing occurring, however, to realize her apprehensions, she endeavoured to fix her attention more closely on her book, in which by degrees she had become so interested that she had read through several chapters without heed of time or place, when she was terrified by suddenly hearing a name, her name, pronounced by a man's voice close to her ear. The book fell from her hand. Lounging on an ottoman, a low couch. Lounging on an ottoman close beside her was Sir Mulberry Hawk. Evidently the worse. If a man be a ruffian at heart, he's never the better. Evidently the worse for wine. "What a delightful studiousness," said this accomplished gentleman. "Was it real, now, or only to display the eyelashes?" Kate looked anxiously towards the door, but made no reply. "I have been looking at 'em for 5 minutes," said Sir Mulberry. "'Pon my soul, they are quite perfect. Why did I speak and destroy such a pretty little picture?" "Do me the favour to be silent now, sir," replied Kate. "No, don't," said Sir Mulberry, folding his crushed hat to lay his elbow on, and bringing himself still closer to the young lady. "'Pon my life, you oughtn't to be. Such a devoted slave of yours, Miss Nickleby. It's an infernal thing to treat him so harshly, upon my soul it is." "I wish you to understand, sir," said Kate, trembling in spite of herself, but speaking with great indignation, "that your behaviour offends and disgusts me. If you have a spark of gentlemanly feeling remaining, you will leave me." "Now, why should I do that?" said Sir Mulberry. "Why will you keep up this appearance of excessive rancour, my sweet creature? Now, be more natural, my dear Miss Nickleby, be more natural, do." Kate hastily rose, but as she rose, Sir Mulberry caught her dress and forced her down again. "Let me go, sir," she cried, her heart welling with anger. "Do you hear? Instantly! This moment!" Sit down, said Sir Mulberry. "I want to talk to you." "Unhand me, sir, at this moment," cried Kate. "Not for the world," rejoined Sir Mulberry. Thus speaking, he leant over as if to replace her in her chair, but the young lady making a violent effort to disengage herself, he lost his balance, measured his length upon the ground, and fell senseless down. As Kate sprung forward to leave the room, Mr. Ralph Nickleby appeared in the doorway and confronted her. "What is this?" asked Ralph. "It is this, sir," replied Kate, violently agitated, "that beneath the roof where I, a helpless girl, your dead brother's child, should most have found protection, I have been exposed to insult which should make you shrink to look at me. Let me pass." Ralph did shrink, as the indignant girl fixed her kindling eye upon him, but he did not comply with her injunction, nevertheless, for he led her to a distant seat, and returning, approached Sir Mulberry, who by this time had come to his senses, risen, and was approaching the door. "Your way lies there, sir," said Ralph in a suppressed voice, which might have been owned by some devil with pride. "What do you mean by that?" demanded his friend fiercely. The swollen veins stood out like sinews on Ralph's wrinkled forehead, and the nerves about his mouth worked as though some unendurable emotion wrung from them. But he smiled disdainfully and again pointed to the door. "Do you know who I am, you old madman?" asked Sir Mulberry. "I know you well," said Ralph. The fashionable vagabond for the moment quite quailed under the steady look of the older sinner, and walked towards the door, muttering as he went. "You wanted that stupid young aristocrat, didn't you?" he said, stopping short when he reached the door, as if a new light had broken in upon him, and confronting Ralph again. "Damme, I was in the way, was I?" Ralph smiled again, but made no answer. "Who brought the fop to you first?" pursued Sir Mulberry. "And how without me could you ever have wound him into your net as you have?" "The net is a large one and rather full," said Ralph. "Take care that it chokes nobody in the meshes." "Why, You'd sell your flesh and blood for money, yourself, if you hadn't already made a bargain with the devil, retorted the other. Do you mean to tell me that your pretty niece was not brought here to ensnare the drunken boy downstairs? Although this hurried dialogue was carried on in a suppressed tone on both sides, Ralph looked involuntarily round to ascertain whether Kate had not moved her position so as to be within hearing. His adversary saw the advantage he had gained and followed it up. "Do you mean to tell me," he asked again, "that that's not so? Do you mean to say that if he had found his way up here instead of me, you wouldn't have been a little more blind or a little more deaf and a little less flourishing than you have been? Come, Nickleby, answer me that." "I tell you this," replied Ralph, "that if I brought her here, it was a matter of business." "Aye, that's the word," interposed Sir Mulberry with a laugh. "You're coming to yourself again." "A matter of business," pursued Ralph, speaking slowly and firmly as a man who had made up his mind to say no more. "Because I thought she might make some impression on the silly youth you have taken in hand and are lending good help to ruin. I knew, knowing him, that it wouldn't be long before he had outraged the girl's feelings, and that unless he offended by mere puppyism and emptiness, he would, with a little management, respect the sex and conduct even of his usurer's niece. But I thought to draw him on more gently by this device, and I did not think of subjecting the girl to the licentiousness and brutality of an old hand like you. Now we understand each other, especially as there was nothing to be got by it, eh?" said Sir Mulberry. "Exactly so," said Ralph. He had turned away and looked over his shoulder to make his last reply. The eyes of the two worthies met, with an expression as if each rascal felt there was no disguising himself from the other, and Sir Mulberry Hawk shrugged his shoulders and looked restlessly towards the spot where Kate was sitting, and then walked slowly out. Ralph closed the door and saw that his niece still remained in the attitude in which he had left her. She had flung herself heavily upon the couch, and with her head drooping over the cushion and her face hidden in her hands, seemed still to be weeping in an agony of shame and grief. Ralph took a chair at some distance, and then another chair a little nearer, then moved a little nearer still, then nearer again, and finally sat himself on the same sofa and laid his hand on Kate's arm. "Hush, my dear," he said as she drew it back, and her sobs burst out afresh. "Hush, hush! Don't mind it now. Don't think of it." "Oh, for pity's sake, let me go home," cried Kate. "Let me leave this house and go home." Yes, you shall," said Ralph. "But dry your eyes first and compose yourself. Let me raise your head. There. "Oh, uncle!" exclaimed Kate, clasping her hands. "What have I done? What have I done that you should subject me to this? If I had wronged you in thought or word or deed, it would have been most cruel to me, and the memory of one you must have loved in some old time. But—" "Only listen to me for a moment," interrupted Ralph, seriously alarmed by the violence of her emotion. "I didn't know it was going to happen. It was impossible for me to foresee it. I did all I could. Come, let us walk about. You are faint with the closeness of the room and the heat of these lamps. You will be better now, if you make the slightest effort." I will do anything," replied Kate, "if only you would send me home." Very well, I will, said Ralph. But first you must get back your looks, for those you have will frighten them, and nobody must know of this but you or I. Now let us walk a few paces. There. Why, you look better even now. With such encouragements as these, Ralph Nickleby walked to and fro, with his niece leaning on his arm, actually trembling beneath her touch. In the same manner, when he judged it prudent to allow her to depart, he supported her downstairs after adjusting her shawl and performing such little offices, most probably for the first time in his life. Across the hall and down the steps Ralph led her too, nor did he withdraw his hand till she was seated in the coach. As the door of the vehicle was roughly closed, a comb fell from Kate's hair close at her uncle's feet. And as he picked it up and returned it into her hand, the light from a neighbouring lamp shone full upon her face. The lock of hair that had escaped and curled loosely over her brow, the traces of tears yet scarcely dry, the flushed cheek, the look of sorrow, all fired some dormant train of recollection in the old man's breast, and the face of his dead brother seemed present before him, with the very look it bore on some occasion of boyish grief, with which the very look it brought the memory back, flashing upon his mind with the distinctness of a scene of yesterday. Ralph Nickleby, who was proof against all appeals of blood and kindred, who was steeled against every tale of sorrow and distress, staggered while he looked, and went back into his house as a man who had seen a spirit from some world beyond the grave.